Ich höre den Stream zu.
Okay, so hello and welcome to this very exciting Saturday of this ÖffiCON. Today there's really an interesting program, and before we start with this really interesting keynote from Alexandra Millonig, I want to just say a few organization things. First of all, I want to thank the German Umweltbundesamt because they are a big supporter of our conference, and without them, we wouldn't be able to do all of this. So thank you very much, Uba. And if you want to know a little bit more about the Umweltbundesamt, you can also go to the exhibition rooms, because in these exhibition rooms, all our partners and supporters have their own rooms, and you can just go around and look around and inform yourself about our partners. So it's a really good opportunity to get to know the Umweltbundesamt and also the GLS Bank and all our supporters and partners. And also today there's also a time slot for networking and get-together. So there are also some rooms in the networking rooms and in the get-together area. So if you want to know all the other attendees of these conference, please go there. And yeah, I'm really welcoming you to these rooms. And today there's a really exciting keynote speech of Alexandra Millonig. And she works at the AIT, the Austrian Institute for Technology, in the Mobility department. She holds a master's degree in regional and urban planning, and also a PhD on pedestrian typologies of the Technology University in Vienna. And her research interest is the mobility behavior of the people. And she asked questions like why we get around, how we get around, and why we choose this mean of transport and not another one. And today she will hold this keynote about a very interesting topic. It's about equality, fairness, and sustainability in mobility. So I'm really, really happy to welcome Alexandra today. And hello, Alexandra, and I would say the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the introduction, and I'm really honored to be here at the conference and talk about what is my favorite to talk about. And this is mobility behavior, and especially why we behave in different ways. What are the reasons for that, and how does this get along with sustainable mobility? So how can we achieve a more sustainable transport system, and what's the human factor in it? So we talk about technology developments and how we can improve the quality of mobility. In this respect, in my talk, it's about the idea of providing the same chances and an equal access to mobility for all. And the question mark means there are a lot of questions related to this topic. And there are not just the questions if mobility for all is actually achievable, but also the more fundamental question, what is mobility for all? What do we mean by that? And I think a couple of weeks ago it was that I attended an event where we were also talking about the right to mobility, also from a gender perspective. But there were participants from all over the world, for example, also from South America, and they have a very different notion concerning the right to mobility than we have. It is a more safety and security question. So it's not just about what's the quality of public transport, but is it safe to use public transport? Is it safe to get to a public transport station, especially if you're a woman or a transgender? So in Europe, we are lucky to have a very good environment and very good public transport system, but still we experience as women imbalance. So we experience barriers, we experience inequality. And the question I want to raise today, and maybe possibly also a little bit answer it, is why is that? What are the reasons for inequality in mobility? What do we mean by mobility equality or transport justice? And how can we achieve that? Where does our notion, our image of mobility come from? It started very early in the 1940s, 1930s, for example. There was a huge development and a huge image campaign also concerning the mobility of the future, the automobile mobility of the future. This is a picture of the Futurama pavilion at the New York World Fair in 1939, and this pavilion was provided by General Motors. And as you can imagine, it was a huge world where these people were moving around on these seats, and they were presented the world of tomorrow, the future world, which was actually more developed around a mobility system, a traffic system, than just the living environment. So there were high-speed connections between cities. Also, cities were built around highly efficient traffic systems, and regions were separated according to the land use there. And that was the image of the future and the image of the modern form of living and the modern form of mobility. So together with that, there was an idea planted in the minds of people that what we want to achieve with mobility is to have the opportunity to go anywhere at any time. So, and this is also a paradigm that we still want to achieve. So during the last decades, we have always strived for developing faster connections, and more capacity on our roads, for example, and also in public transport. And so what we wanted to achieve also in the later decades is to also provide access to mobility for the groups that we perceived as disadvantaged when it comes to mobility. So for disabled groups, for example, for women with children, and so on. So what we did very much, especially in Europe, we tried to make our public transport systems, for example, fit for disadvantaged groups. So we developed barrier-free entries, for example, room for prams and strollers, and also for wheelchairs. So this is something where Europe also has been always, a little bit of a front runner, because when traveling around in the world, which I did, not now, but which I did at conferences, I also realized that we in Europe, we have a lot more chances for disadvantaged groups to use also public transport, because metros and buses, they are not necessarily barrier-free everywhere. Also, the stations are not necessarily barrier-free everywhere. So they are often only accessible via stairs. And there's no room in the train cars for prams and wheelchairs. So we deem ourselves lucky here, but still, it's not all peace. It's not all the ideal world that we are thinking of, because there's still little room that can be used. So if there are more than 2 or 3 people with a pram who want to enter a bus, they might need to take another one. And these young ladies here, they have refused entry to 3 consecutive buses. So every bus driver told them it's not enough room for them, and they wanted to travel together because they are friends. So of course, this is kind of it's a difficulty, because we cannot build huge buses to provide room for 20 prams, but it's also, of course, a disadvantage if you have to travel with prams or in a wheelchair or any other luggage that you have to carry around. And in this respect, it's also important to note that it's in more cases than just the average. It's the case that women are affected by such a disadvantage. So let's think about what is female mobility actually. So what is the characteristic of female mobility? How does it evolve? What are the reasons that these specific patterns develop? So when we think about female mobility and we look into the statistics of mobility surveys, for example, and also what is usually described when talked about female mobility, then they often say that female mobility is the future because women are more, they use more public transport, they walk more. And the reason is, at least that's the assumption, women are more aware of the environment. They are eager to protect the environment. They strive for sustainability, but also for health. They are more health aware. They want to get around in a healthy way, so they walk more. And they also have to travel shorter distances than men. And they do more in their immediate surrounding. They don't travel that far. And so it is often said that female mobility is actually what we need to strive for in the future, and women lead the way to future mobility. But I would like to ask the question, is this mobility behavior pattern that women show, is it actually something that is out of their conscious, out of their wishes? Or is it maybe the other way around, because it's also a human nature to explain your situation and explain it in a positive way. So you want to rationalize your behavior and find reasons for that, even if you're not really, if this is not your preferred behavior. So what we do, for example, if we use a lot of public transport, we explain it because it's easier for us. It is faster than traveling by car in the city, and it's more sustainable. It's healthier, and so on. But on the other hand, if you're a woman and you don't have children, for example, and you have your own car, you will also find your reasons and rationalize driving your car because it's faster and you can have your stuff around you and it's safer for you because you don't have to use public transport at night and so on. So we usually cannot rely on what our first impression tells us about behavior, and we need to dive deeper and understand what is actually mobility behavior and what is influencing mobility behavior. So I would like to start to explain that by describing a few constants of mobility behavior. So those are behavior patterns that are the same over the centuries, all around the world. It's pretty much the same on average, and it seems to be kind of a human nature. One of that constants, which is also quite well known, is that we usually, on average, travel for about 1.5 hours per day. So it doesn't matter if you have no car, one car, or two cars in your household. It doesn't matter if you're in a big city or somewhere in the countryside. It doesn't matter if you're in the US or in Europe or in Asia. That's a pattern that shows everywhere. Another constant is that we have usually, we travel 3 or 4 trips per day. So we have three main destinations, 2 or 3 main destinations that we repeatedly travel to, and the next constant is that goes along with that is that we have a very repetitive behavior. So we have routines. We usually come back at home at night, and we have specific destinations that we repeatedly travel to. And so these 3 constants are, they show all over the world, and they are known to be true for centuries already. That's something that you can see in the structure of ancient cities, for example, and the size of ancient cities. And the 4th constant is that that needs to be proven, but it seems to be that we spend about 12 to 15% of our disposable income for mobility. So that means if you don't have that much money, you will maybe not be able to afford a car, and you will have to use public transport, or you will not be able to afford 2 cars in the household, and only one is going to use the car. Usually the one who has to travel larger distances, and usually, as we see in the data, it's the man, the male partner in a household who is using the car. And if you are, if you have more money at hand, even if you are a person who is aware of the environment, you might not have a car, but you travel around the world, and you fly to different destinations also to get to learn the culture there and see the world and broaden your horizon. But you use the money also very much either for a bigger car, a more expensive car, or for flying. So, what are the reasons why we travel around the way we travel around? So what makes the differences now in our behavior? We have learned about the constants in our behavior, but still we're not behaving the same, all of us. So what causes differences? The most apparent one is, do we have our destinations nearby, or do we have to travel larger distances to reach them? So are we in a city, for example, where we have a lot of facilities around, some of them even in walkable distance? Or are we maybe in a smaller village outside in the countryside, where we don't have that many facilities, and where our working place is in another village or in another city where we have to travel to? So this is already it is already explaining a lot of our mobility behavior, but not all. Especially when it comes to women, what influences our mobility behavior is what are we responsible for? What is our daily routine? Is it traveling to work? Is it to running errands? Is it to care for children or for older relatives, for example? And the more responsibilities you have, the more you have to pack in your normal routine day by day. Of course, the more trips you will have. And it already shows that although the data says that women travel less far distances than men, they have more trips per day. So the constants that we know about, they are also kind of an indicator if there's some kind of imbalance. So if we see that women, especially single mothers or mothers of 3 or more children, they spend significantly more time in the transport system, and they have more trips than men. This is already an indicator of an imbalance. So that's the demand itself, what causes trips and what causes how many trips we have and how far we travel. When it comes now to which mode we select for doing those trips, we can use theories from sociology, for example. I like to use the social practice theory, because it's in a very simple way. It explains really a lot, and it's very comprehensible how mobility patterns develop. You need three components to perform a specific behavior, not just mobility behavior, any behavior like making coffee or taking a shower or deciding which mode to take for a trip. And that's what I already translated into the mobility world. In social practice theory, this would be material, but in the mobility environment, it's access. Do you have access to a specific mode of transport? Do you own a car, for example? Also, can you afford a car? Do you have a public transport station somewhere nearby? And can you use it? Do you have physical limitations that maybe make it hard for you to use it? Do you sit in a wheelchair, for example? Are you blind, or do you have any other physical or sensory disability? And this also includes access to information. So do we know about the public transport network, for example? How is this information accessible? The second component you need is the ability to use that material. So that's more on the legal or cognitive side. So you need to know, you need to have learned, or it needs to be intuitive enough to be used to make a coffee, to buy a ticket for public transport, or you need to have the permission to use public transport alone. So you need to be old enough, for example, or you need to be old enough to make it to have your own driving license and so on. And the third component, so if you have the material and you know how to use it, what defines now if you do that behavior is you have to want to do it. So it's the ambition. Is it important for you to do that? That's on the emotional side. Is it because your friends do it, also do it? Is it because you want to achieve some kind of value, sustainability or health? Or is it fun that you want to achieve? Is fun for you the most important thing? So the upper two, they can be described as this is what defines if you can perform a behavior. And ambition describes if you want to do that. Even if you can, you might not want to do that. You might be able to use public transport, and that's what we see very much in the data. There's a large share of the population is in principle, they could use public transport, but they simply don't want to for different reasons. But now let's step back to the gender perspective. Where can we, based on these basic influence factors that we have discussed here, how can we now disclose inequalities here and disadvantages? So the sources of inequality are, for example, growing distances and segregated land use, which is actually affecting both genders, and it's not an inequality in itself, but if you combine it with the multiple responsibilities that usually women have, it leads to the growing distances make it harder for women to do more than the 3 or 4 trips per day, because it takes a lot of time, more than the 1.5 hours per day. And they also can only do shorter distances because they have to use the time at hand, and they don't have the opportunity to use faster modes of transport. So they have to see what can they do in the immediate surrounding, in the neighborhood, and that's the reason why they use why they walk more, for example, than men do, and why they use more public transport, because they don't have that access to the car if there's only one car in the household, which is also usually the fact in if you are if the household is financially not that well doing, and also in cities where you don't have to room and place for more than one car in the household. So this is already turning to the limited access. So if you are in a household with only one car, it's usually you have the second priority to use that. Then there are also other access limitations. You might encounter barriers when using public transport or a shared car, for example, when you try to get around with a small child, for example. Shared cars, they usually don't have a seat for a safety seat for a child in the car. So you have to bring your own to make sure that your child is in a safety seat in the car. So that's putting more effort, more burden on women in using different forms, shared mobility or public transport and so on. Then limited abilities, they can lead to the fact that also, especially older women, they are not able to use specific modes of transport, for example. Especially in the older generation, we see that many of them, it's now with younger generations getting older, it's changing. But very old women, and they are usually also single women, because usually they survive their partners when getting old. They don't have a driver's license, for example. So many of older women, they are dependent on their children or other people in their family network to drive them around and to help them. But they also, at the same time, they have learned not to put a burden on anybody else. So what the result is that they don't like to ask, and they are in danger of suffering from loneliness at home. And they also often they even say they don't want to get around that much. They are happy at home. But that's another form of explaining your situation to make you feel better, because you want to do that, and it's not in your interest to get around that much. And women are especially also victims of deep concerns when using specific forms of transport. Fear. They are very concerned about their safety, their security. They are ashamed if they maybe fail to use a complex system, so they rather don't use it at all. They have limited self-confidence. They avoid to use public transport or go to a public transport station at certain times at night, for example. So those are, especially for women, those are very severe influences that hinder them to use public transport. And the result is the mobility patterns that we see and that we measure then in the surveys, and that women have more complex trip chains. They do more trips, shorter distances than men. So knowing that, if we know that, and we think about the reason why it is that way, and it is not necessarily a desired behavior, but very much also a behavior that is necessary or forced upon them, what can we do about that? What can we change? Growing distances and segregated land use is something that we have built during the last decades, and we haven't turned around that trend already. So what we can do here, we need to change spatial planning paradigms. But that's a long-term thing. That's nothing that's helping women now in this situation, but we really need to do that. That's one of the main factors why we have inequalities. When it comes to the multiple responsibilities that women have, this needs a change in societal value of unpaid domestic work. That's also, I'm afraid, more on the long-term side, because societal change really takes a lot of time. And this is also something we cannot fix by improving the mobility system. So that's a societal issue. It's a societal imbalance that also needs a broader bundle of measures to change, because it's not only affecting mobility. Limited access is something that is already addressed in various measures. In the last decades already, we tried to make our public transport system barrier-free. We provided specific discounts for older people, for example. We make room for prams. So there are best practices how to do that, and this just needs to be rolled out ubiquitously, so everywhere. It's not achieved everywhere already, but that's something we are aware of and where we put a lot of effort in it. When it comes to the limited abilities, that's another issue, because that's not that well addressed already, because services, for example, when we look at ticket vending machines, they are in some cases really complicated. Or if you're used to a specific ticket system in your hometown and you travel to another country maybe and another system, you are usually overwhelmed. And that's not necessarily only a gender issue, but it is when you combine it with the emotional part. So when you are older and when you are female, you usually have you are more cautious. You are afraid of doing mistakes. You are afraid of making a fool of yourself. That's not so much with younger people, and not so much with males, because they want they have learned they need to appear self-confident, and they need to master every situation. That's something that women usually are not learning in their childhood. They are allowed to ask somebody for help, for example. And this is especially the emotional part is something where we don't have that many concepts already. So we do have some ideas about how we can ease concerns concerning safety and security, or make the systems more secure by CCTV, for example, or other means. But when it comes to the timid self-identity of women, there are hardly any solutions, but that goes along a lot with societal value and the societal image of how women should be and how men should be. So what we can do, of course, we can address all these barriers that we encounter and make it then more accessible, more able, and more ambitious to use public transport, for example. But if we also focus very much on the responsibilities that women have, we might also run into the risk of forcing them to stay in that role. On the other hand, if we think that the right to mobility means that everybody needs to have access to fast transport and cars and all shared mobility, we also might force women to just behave more like men, which is not a sustainable way. So that's kind of a contradiction. But there may be also solutions how to solve both the climate and the gender issue. And I would like to close my talk here with a small thought experiment and a project that we did, a study which we did based on the statistics and the calculations from the Austrian Umweltbundesamt, the Austrian Federal Agency, Environmental Agency, where we looked at the numbers for Austria, and we simply calculated what would it mean if the the CO2 reduction goals that we have in Austria for 2050, if they would be mandatory today. And if they would be mandatory today, it would mean that even with an electric car running on green energy, you would be able to travel only 3 kilometers per day in person, and then you would exceed that limit already. So we have a huge, really, really huge effort here to master. And the idea we came up with in that project was a mobility budget. So weighing the reduction goals that we have and distributing the amount of emissions that we are allowed now and in the coming years, and should be declining, the amount of CO2 we are allowed to emit until we reach that goal, distributed in the society as to every citizen in Austria, and it is not allowed to exceed that limit. So you do it on a yearly basis, but to make it fair, and that's the main point here, to make it fair, you have to consider the spatial situation and also the social situation. So people who are not living in the city, who are more have to cover longer distances, and especially people who have to trips to out of their responsibilities for family members, for example, they would receive more emission certificates. So women would receive more than men, for example. And if you have such a mobility budget, an individual mobility budget, there are two things that are resulting from that. So you know what you are responsible for and where you need to organize your mobility to stay in these limits. So you have some kind of freedom here to choose. And on the policy level, you see who is very much burdened by very tough mobility budgets, and where do you need to invest into more sustainable transport, into better land use planning and more facilities in the walkable distance, for example. So you have a very clear indication of where you need to put your measures and what to prioritize. And in this idea, it's the when we think about it, it is said that women have they show the mobility of the future, the mobility behavior of the future, and women are the future. Thinking about that, it's actually men who should take the burden of change in the future, because they have to change more, they have to change their mobility patterns more. And we not only have to think about how can we enable women to travel sustainable with all the responsibilities. In this idea, men would also like to have more certificates, and they would take more responsibilities to get more certificates, for example, and it could lead to a more just world. And that's an idea that we are putting forward at the moment, and I'm starting 2 projects, one on a national base and one international European project, especially to find out what is this fair key that we can use to distribute emission certificates. And yeah, maybe at the next ÖffiCON I can tell you more about the results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this very inspiring speech. Thank you. And you can see Alexandra again this afternoon on the panel Mobility for All. We are very excited for this panel too, and we hope you all have a nice day at this ÖffiCON Saturday. Thank you again, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.